no secret. It's plain to see. I love you, and you love me. It's no secret. You know it's true. You love me. I love you. The only time we seem to meet is in the middle of the night. Only then can I feel your heartbeat. Till something's not right. Together I see you and me, always and all time. But not everyone would agree. To them it's a crime. It's no secret. It's plain to see. Yes, I love you, and you love me. And it's no secret. You know it's true. You love me. Yes, I love you. Each day I think of you, looking for some sign that you feel the same way too. And I know you're mine. We can't use no telephone, but others can hear. And all I get is a dial tone, but the message is clear. It's no secret, and it's plain to see. Yes, I love you. I know you love me.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn on video so we can say hello. So, hi friends, welcome back to True Crime Convos. I am your host, Lainey. Hopefully you can hear me just fine, and we are going to get started. I'm very excited to welcome you to kind of the new and improved True Crime Convos. We're on the Fireside app, but we're also simulcasting to YouTube and also to Twitch. So I am very excited to have those. Now, I am also checking the comments on Twitch and on YouTube because we can't necessarily see that within the Fireside app. So welcome. This is also going to be a separate podcast feed. You're going to be able to find True Crime Convos on a podcast platform, pretty much anywhere you listen to podcasts if you're interested in catching up and learning more. So tonight we are going to be talking about the TikTok viral true crime trial that's been happening. It actually wrapped up on Monday, or really Friday of last week. And then Monday, they made a decision on how they were moving forward with the sentencing phase, if you will. So the individual that we're going to be discussing tonight, or you're going to be learning about, their name is Darrell Brooks. And this individual, I heard about the parade incident that happened last year, but, unfortunately, the way that things work within this true crime world, if you will, is that these incidents seem to be happening more frequently. And it really was something that I was aware of, but I didn't spend too much time in researching or anything like that. It wasn't until I started seeing a lot of TikTok videos that I really started to kind of wonder what this case was all about, really what was happening with this defendant and why people were so kind of concerned about his representation in court and, these clips that were being posted on TikTok that don't really tell the full story. At least you don't think they tell the full story, but they really do. So, this individual, his name is Darrell Edward Brooks. He's actually a junior, and he lived in the Rufus King neighborhood located on the north side of the city of Milwaukee, which is the heaviest populated city of Wisconsin. And you may see me kind of looking off to the side. I'm checking the chat for other areas. Feel free to also put in your own chats and comments in the Fireside app if you're joining us. Now, Darrell himself says that his mother, Dawn Woods, was a typical Southern woman of strong Christian faith who raised him and his older sister as a single mother. Brooks considered himself as having grown up without a father. And his father and his grandfather were actually alcoholics, and a number of other family members of his also struggled with substance abuse. Brooks' father had frequently abused his mother, and they subsisted mainly on welfare. Now, alongside these factors, the death of his grandmother, who he was actually really close with, devastated his mental health. When he was 11, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and he was told that he was manic depressive and was also severely depressed. Now, those two things seem to kind of go together with me in terms of manic depression. Obviously means that you're depressed, but it can change, right? You have episodes of mania, and then you have episodes of depression. So he was admitted to a mental hospital when he was only 12 years old, and he had multiple suicide attempts while he was still just a child. And he continued to feel suicidal throughout the rest of his life and had been on medication for his various mental illnesses since he was 12 years old. Now, you have to kind of take that into account. I'm a mom, so it's obviously concerning and really devastating to feel like you are helpless when it comes to helping your child. And I would think that Dawn did the best that she could in getting her son help. He was diagnosed, he was given medication. So I think, that she took the right steps in trying to get him help. She tried her best to steer him away from the street life, but more than a few of his friends were in prison or dead by the time they were 17. And 17 is actually the same age that Daryl was when he started to get in trouble with the law. And so we're going to talk a little bit about his previous crimes and his personal life. Now, he was charged with his first felony in 1999 at the age of 17. This was for substantial battery with intent of bodily harm. Now, he was sentenced to 6 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. We are seeing it, and it's not true for everybody, right? I want to make that disclaimer that we're talking about some pretty violent episodes, and we'll be talking about some violent episodes as we move forward within this episode. And I want to issue the disclaimer that not everybody who experiences issues with their mental health or are diagnosed bipolar or manic depressive or have major depressive disorder, they're not prone to violence. In fact, I believe the statistic says that they're actually prone to be victims of violence. So I just want to leave you with that disclaimer so that there's no confusion on kind of where we stand on our end on the show side. So in 2002 and 2003, we also saw him getting some misdemeanor charges, but they weren't connected to his previous offenses. He actually spent 50 days in prison for having THC, which is the main compound found in cannabis. He had got a 20-day sentence for resisting or obstructing a police officer. And we'll see this kind of frequently throughout his career as a criminal, if you will. In 2005, he again resisted an officer and was sentenced to 2 days prison time, which I find to be kind of an interesting sentence for this type of crime, right? We know him. He has this history of resisting arrest, being violent, as we've seen multiple assault and battery charges. So, I'm surprised that there aren't more hefty sentences for, either evading arrest or even for resisting arrest. So it's interesting to see that, he's getting really kind of a slap on the wrist. I was watching the new Netflix documentary called I Am a Stalker, and the individual, the perpetrator, was basically saying that he was given such light sentences for all of the crimes that he was committing that he put it in his mind that he basically could get away with anything. And so that he continued escalating in his behavior. It is a really mind-opening show. I've never really delved into stalkers or their, mental health issues that may go along with being a stalker. So very, very interesting Netflix show. Would recommend this one because also victims are involved in it. You have the people who were stalked kind of giving their side of the experience, and then the stalkers giving, their perspective, which to them is their reality. It's very interesting to see. So in 2005, he ends up leaving Milwaukee and moves to Reno, Nevada. Now there, he raped and impregnated a 15-year-old girl, claiming that she had told him that she was 18 years old. And he was charged with felony statutory rape or felony statutory sexual seduction and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. And he was convicted of this crime in 2006. He ends up pleading guilty to settle the case, only to break the terms of the deal by contacting the girl first by calling her using a stolen phone card, and then finding her at a bus stop and confronting her there. So because of that, they sent him back to jail for 129 days. Now, due to this conviction, Brooks ends up having to register as a sex offender in Nevada, but he actually fails to do that. And he has to register pretty much wherever he goes. And he, to this day, because I heard it in court on Monday, he still has failed to meet that obligation. But he serves his sentence in the Northern Nevada Correctional Center from March 2007 to September 2008. And during this time, he took part in a documentary called Crystal Darkness, and he ends up discussing his methamphetamine addiction and his own failures as a father. In the documentary, He stated, "I thought I would be the greatest dad ever. I'm going to give him everything that I didn't have." Then it's like really setting in. You actually become the drug. Now, he had abandoned his first child before they had even reached 3 months old. The child's mother is still to this day chasing a paternity case on Brooks for his failure to pay child support. And by 2011, he owed around $17,000 in child support payments. Now, he continues, like I said, this life of crime. From 2009 to 2011, he's jailed several times for so many different reasons. First, he had a attempted strangulation suffocation charge and another count of resisting and obstructing a police officer. He again resisted an officer when he was pulled over in Milwaukee due to him driving without a seatbelt. Now, Brooks started to drive away as the officer was addressing him, which then forced the officer to kind of get into his car because he needed to avoid being hit. Now, when the officer gained control of Brooks's car, and to be clear, it wasn't the police officer getting back into his own vehicle, it was him getting into Brooks's vehicle. So when the officer gained control of the car and stopped it, Brooks fled and then was found hiding in a children's playhouse nearby. I think we'll constantly see this kind of pattern with Brooks, is where he constantly attempts to evade responsibility for the crimes that he's committed. Again, in 2016, he fails to register as a sex offender and is arrested because of that. He posts bail, but failed to appear in court, and there is a warrant that's still active in Nevada for bail jumping. He ends up coming back to Milwaukee in 2020, but he's arrested for firearm-related charges. He was living with his mother, Dawn, and his nephew, Anaji, in Arlington Heights, Milwaukee. And Brooks and his nephew were fighting over a cell phone when Anaji got into a friend's car to leave. He tried to disconnect himself from the situation. And so Brooks walked into the front yard with a gun and fired one shot at them. Officers found Brooks with a stolen Beretta 9mm handgun, and he was also in possession of 3 methamphetamine pills, which I didn't know. Color me shocked, I guess, or new to this piece of information, but I had no idea that methamphetamines were actual or came in a pill form. I thought that was kind of interesting. I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but I kind of am. But he did have 3 methamphetamine pills. So it goes to show that he was still actively engaged in drugs at the time. Everything kind of was going on in his life. So he faced 10 years in jail because of this, but ended up avoiding that penalty. Now, due to COVID-19, we saw a lot of kind of stoppage in the court system, and a lot of cases kind of get thrown out or say, hey, you know what, we're not going to deal with that. So basically, due to COVID-19 related delays and case backlogs, the court was unable to guarantee him a speedy trial. So his bail was reduced from $7,500 to $500, and he was released in February of 2021. Now, Anaji requested that he have a no-contact order with his uncle because he feared for his life following the incident. And I think if you grew up around Darrell Brooks and understood that he was impossible to read and that he could literally snap at any second with violence, not just anger, but actual physical violence, I do not blame his nephew for wanting to have no contact with him. But as we all know, no contact orders, restraining orders, whatever you want to call them, really is just a piece of paper. That's all it is. There's no guarantee that you will be left alone by this person. A piece of paper will not stop somebody from crossing your threshold. So I really wish that there was more that could be done. And maybe there is. I would love to hear from you if there are actionable things that we as true crime content creators can push in terms of information or even legislation that we could help with. I think that would be incredible to assist with. So he asked for a no contact order. And again, understandable. Now, Brooks ends up moving to Georgia in 2021 and almost immediately gets arrested again. On May 27th, he ends up repeatedly striking a woman at a motel, and he was charged with misdemeanor battery and released on signature bond the next day. I think it's also important to note, and I failed to put this into my notes when we were looking over the case, but I think it's also really important to note that he was engaging in sex trafficking. Part of the time that he spent in Nevada, there was a video that was released where he was basically saying that he had, in his own words, pimped out baby mama, essentially, the woman, or the teenager rather, that he impregnated. And he was just braggadocious in that video. If you watch the Law and Crime YouTube channel, or you look at anything related to Daryl Brooks on YouTube, you'll find plenty of information out there and plenty of videos to watch about, kind of his demeanor. And you can tell how very self-assured he is in in his own knowledge and in his own behavior, that he sees absolutely nothing wrong with anything he does. He is the smartest guy in the room. Everybody else is the problem, and everybody else is causing him to react in the way that he's reacting. He's only responding to what he feels are slights against him that are purposefully happening to him. This happens in court, and this happens out in his, real life outside of prison. And I'm sure he's just a delight in the county jail to deal with. If I was a jailer, I'm thinking of 60 days in. If I was a guard, I would be like, I'm putting this guy in solitary 100% of the time, because he is just, if you saw his behavior in any of the court videos or any of the TikTok videos, I mean, I've been watching trials for at least 2 decades, and I have never seen this type of conduct from somebody representing themselves. It was so surprising to see and hear. So absolutely interesting if you are interested in following the trial. It's over now, but we do have some updates to offer. But you can still look back on when everything started, and also the pre-trial hearing where he ends up deciding to represent himself. There's something key that comes up later on in the trial. He essentially says, and we'll get to it in the trial, I know I'm jumping ahead, but he essentially tries every time to avoid answering the question the judge is asking him directly. He will walk around it, kind of answer it, or say, nope, don't understand, but he actually does understand. He's just saying that because he thinks it will delay. And that's been his tactic since the beginning. So after that misdemeanor battery, he ends up being released on a signature bond the next day. He returned to Wisconsin for the final time in April of 2021. So we don't hear a lot about what happened between April and November. All we know is that in November of 2021, his behavior escalated when he harassed and assaulted his ex-girlfriend and the mother of his child at a motel in Lenox Heights. So he pounded on her door, screaming at her, snatches her phone when she tried to get past him, and drove away with it as she fled. So, she's going to a gas station and trying to call for help or trying to call for a friend. He ends up finding her walking towards a gas station nearby and demanded that she gets into the car, which is a Ford Red Escape. That is indisputable fact. When she refuses, he ends up getting out of the car, or he's already out of the car. And there's also a video that was submitted into evidence about this, so you can see it in real time. When she refuses, he ends up hitting her in the face with a closed fist and hits her with his car. She had already called friends to kind of come and help her. There was 2 witnesses, and including the victim herself, who were called as defense witnesses, which I thought was so bizarre. But there were 2 other people at the scene who were trying to intervene and help. And when the male shows up to help the ex-girlfriend with the interaction she's having with Daryl, Daryl ends up getting in his car. She ends up being hospitalized, and police report that she had a bloodied face and a swollen lip, and that there were tire tracks on her left pant leg. She told police that Brooks was jealous and controlling, and he had tried to choke her and threatened to kill her on several occasions. Brooks denied these allegations, continues to deny these allegations, and claims that she made these all up because she was drunk and, drinking in the park with her friends. He tried to bring that information up while he was questioning her, and it was quickly objected to and sustained by the judge. He was charged with recklessly endangering the safety of another person, bail jumping, and disorderly conduct. His bail at the time was only $1,000, which his mother, Dawn, posted, which inevitably allowed his release on November 16th. Now, on November 18th, there are papers that are filed regarding a paternity case for the child Brooks shares with that ex-girlfriend. And again, for this child in particular, he owed roughly $41,240 in connection with this case. So he's just not meeting the obligations he has to his children as a father, which is so interesting because he brings up in court while he's questioning his ex-girlfriend, her credibility, and he hinges that on her ability to be a good mom and whether or not the children that she has are living with her, which is irrelevant to the case and irrelevant really to her credibility. So now we're in the parade. So at 4:35 p.m. on November 21st, 2021, police in Waukesha were called to a domestic dispute that was possibly involving a knife. Brooks' neighbor witnessed his ex-girlfriend fleeing from him barefoot with a black eye, and she claimed that the pair would often fight outside Brooks' home. And before police could reach the scene, they were diverted to another scene. So at the same time that was happening, where the police were responding to this domestic dispute, Waukesha was holding their 58th annual holiday parade. And it had been canceled the previous year, as you know, like many things were due to COVID. But it returned in 2021 with the theme of comfort and joy. And the family event had all sorts of groups participating in the parade: marching bands, dancing groups, cheerleading, high school sports team. It was just truly a bunch of people ready and excited to celebrate the holidays. And even though at the time the pandemic wasn't over, restrictions were starting to be lifted. So I think everybody was just kind of excited to usher in, a new year, if you will. So at around 4:40 p.m., the festivities come to an abrupt and horrifying end as Brooks, who's driving his red Ford Explorer, it's actually his mother's red Ford Explorer, oh my gosh, slammed through the barricades and began to tear through the crowd. I would caution you, because there is video evidence out there of this scene taking place. I would caution you that what you are imagining in your head is terrible. What you will see on that video is worse than you could imagine. So I would say that if you are very sensitive to those types of videos, I would caution you 100% and say it's really not worth watching. What you're imagining, like I said, is terrible, but what you'll see is extremely disheartening, tragic. I mean, it's really hard to put into words. It is absolutely horrendous to see. So he slams through the barricades and begins to tear through the crowd. Now, there's an onlooker named Tyler who's 28, and he reported hearing cheers from the back of the parade, but he later realized that those weren't cheers. They were actually screams. And one officer shot once at the car to try and stop the driver, but he immediately stopped what he was doing because he was afraid of hitting someone in the crowd and was later put on administrative leave, which is typical. It's a typical protocol whenever somebody fires their weapon following an incident. So Tyler and several officers at the scene believe Brooks was driving in a way so as to deliberately hit as many people as possible. He was going from side to side and targeting people and only seemed to swerve to avoid cars. And he made no attempt to avoid hitting people. And those who could see the driver said he did this with an expression of calm. He was completely void of emotion. You'll see still images of Brooks as he's driving the car through the parade. And it is absolutely true what they're saying, that he has this very blank expression on his face. And it is, when you realize the totality of the damage that he's done, again, there's no dispute in his guilt and what he did. But when you realize the totality, seeing the absolute numbness, the vacancy in his eyes and in his expression shows you there's kind of some deliberate focus on who he's targeting. So his actions that day killed 5 people and injured over 60 others. There were 18 children taken to the hospital following the attack, with injuries ranging from facial lacerations to severe head trauma. 6 of those children were in critical condition, and 1 passed away due to his injuries, bringing the total death count to 6. The victims of his attack were Virginia Sorensen, who was 79, Leanna Owen, 71, Tamara Durand, 52, Jane Coolidge, 52, Wilhelm Hospel, 81, and lastly, Jackson Sparks, who was only 8 years old. Footage, again, like I said, is available online as the entire event was being televised, and many spectators had been recording for themselves just before the attack and therefore during it. It was difficult for me to watch it, and I've kind of seen really gruesome and terrible things as it relates to, what I do and the content that I create. Not for any glorification or not for any, wow, I wonder what this looks like, but truly to kind of understand the carnage, right? Or to understand the totality of the impact that happened. This was something different. It's so hard for me to understand unprovoked mass attacks. 9/11, Waukesha, the Aurora shooting, any type of mass school shooting, those are really hard for me to wrap my brain around. I don't understand why they happen, and I don't understand what lives in a person to make them want to do that. I have an easier time, while it's not okay, I have an easier time understanding why a husband and wife may kill each other, right? Or why a teenager who wants to be with their boyfriend decides to kill their family. Those types of decisions, they don't make sense, but I can understand them better. I don't understand the mass types of shootings or killings. I think my content editor, Brittany, she is a person who is really interested in those and the psychology piece behind it. We look at the Parkland shooter. We'll be talking about that soon in a new True Crime Convos, because there's so much dissent over the jury's decision and even the defense that Nicholas Cruz was offered. So we'll talk a lot about kind of those situations, but I'm definitely wanting to have more guests on who have the psychological background. Dr. Stacy Merkin was a really great resource that we use for True Crime Convos in its previous form. But yeah, I think it will offer a lot of great information when we can bring those mental health professionals who have the experience of working with those individuals. So now we're to the aftermath of the Waukesha parade. So Daniel Ryder, who was 24, was watching football, totally unaware of the unfolding events when his doorbell rang. And a man claiming to be homeless asked to use his phone to call an Uber or a Lyft. Now, he was feeling generous, so he was like, you know what? I don't feel threatened by this guy. I'm going to go ahead and let him in. He ends up making him a sandwich, and he lets him call for an Uber or a Lyft. But then he gets this weird feeling. He starts hearing police sirens, and he goes and seeing police, and he tells the man, hey, you need to go, because he sees police on the street, and he thought maybe this is the guy they're looking for. And Daryl actually tries to return back to the house, claiming he forgot his ID, but Ryder refused him entry and watched as Brooks, the man who was professing to be homeless, ended up being arrested. And Ryder often wonders what would have happened if Brooks had managed to get an Uber, which ended up showing up moments later. Police Chief Dan Thompson assured the public that Brooks had acted alone and that there was no evidence he was involved in a terrorist movement, and that he didn't target anyone specifically in the parade that he knew, which 100%. No, it wouldn't have mattered to me if he knew somebody and then killed those additional 6 people. That makes no difference to me. I think this whole situation was so astounding. It still boggles my mind when you really take some time to digest what he did. It's just incredible to try and wrap your mind around it. I don't know any other way to eloquently say that. So on Tuesday, November 23rd, he ends up being charged with 5 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, later becoming 6 with the death of Jason Sparks. So the judge ends up ordering that his bail be $5 million, as he was both a flight risk and a real danger to the community. This wasn't some supposed danger that some people, some prosecutors will say, oh yeah, he's a danger because he committed, one crime, if you will, to one specific individual. But he truly is a danger to the community because almost 70 people were affected by this, and many more because they had loved ones in the parade who were, targeted in some way by the vehicle or killed by this vehicle. And I think it's also fair to note, we'll talk about this later as we get into the trial, but at any point he could have stopped. And he chose not to. Body after body was hitting his car. And at any point, regardless of any malfunction he tried to say was happening to the vehicle, he could have stopped. He could have tried to divert the car into something else, into a building, or yelled at people to get out of the way. My car is going crazy. He did none of that. So his statements that he'll end up making later are baseless and truly, I think, show how depraved he is as a human being. So the following day, Brooks' mother, Dawn Woods, released a letter offering condolences to the victim, saying, "We are not making excuses, but we believe what has happened is because he was not given the help and resources he needed to deal with his addiction and mental health troubles. But part of that is also needing to take responsibility and accountability for the fact that you didn't ask for help." He didn't ask for any help, as far as I'm aware, in the research that we've done. The local school district and university ended up canceling classes and offered counseling services in the aftermath of the parade. Flags across the country were flown at half-mast out of respect for the victims. First Lady Jill Biden met privately with many of the families, including the families of victims, laying flowers at the memorial for those victims. So now we're getting into the trial, and Brooks' trial was scheduled to start for October 3rd and run through the 28th. In June, he tried to change his plea from not guilty to not guilty by mental defect, and he withdrew this defense when no psychiatric evaluation supported this, because he doesn't have a mental defect, technically speaking. And it's worth noting that despite his rich history of charges and convictions, Brooks had never before attempted to plead insanity or incompetence in a criminal court. And he also dismissed his public defenders just before the trial began, electing to defend himself in court despite having no legal training. And as of October 3rd, Brooks is on trial for 83 criminal offenses and faces a mandatory life sentence if convicted of the 6 counts of homicide. Waukesha County Circuit Court Judge Jennifer Doro, who presides over this trial, has been keeping record of how many times she has been forced to banish Brooks from the courtroom or mute his microphone. That judge is incredible. A national hero she is, because she truly has exerted and displayed so much patience when it comes to Darrell Brooks, and doing her best to ensure that A, a mistrial doesn't happen, and B, that he has really no strong basis for appeal. She could have charged him in contempt many times. He tried to, put that in her mind. He tried to say, "Are you charging me in contempt?" etc. It was just ridiculous how disrespectful he was to the court, and to the system of justice. It was astounding to see. And maybe there are people out there who feel like, yeah, what he did was terrible and he deserves to be punished for it. But how he acted in court may not be such a big deal to them. And I'd like to understand why they may think that, if they think that like it's okay to be disrespectful. In my mind, what I consider to be disrespectful, I would like to understand that. So if you have any feedback on that, of what you think is, we're not defending his actions that day, but maybe his actions in court in the sense of how he's defending himself, not through argument, but truly just by continuing to bring up issues, continuing to want to ensure the record is correct, etc. And I think because he doesn't have the legal background and he believes, like I said earlier, he is the smartest person in the room. He's only responding to situations because they're intentionally happening to him. And he therefore is not responsible for his reactions, because if everybody would just leave him alone, he wouldn't have to be who he is, which is terrible. So on October 5th, Brooks, On October 5th, Brooks requests an adjournment of his trial. He does this a lot, actually, or did this a lot. He tells the court that he believes he has COVID and he needs to wait until Friday, October 7th, for the test results. And he goes, "Listen, I've had people close to me who have passed away from COVID and I'm frightened." And Judge Doro denies the motion, saying if he was actually concerned, he would take the rapid test in court, like he was offered. And he ends up refusing that. So prosecutors say he had been heard on jail phone calls telling his mother he was going to delay the trial, that this was just a delay tactic, and Doro agreed. We'll see that consistently. If you watch the videos of the trial, again, it's concluded at this point. We're waiting on sentencing. But if you watch that, you can see what he's doing, that he is intentionally trying to delay the trial as much as possible by interjecting, by trying to bring up weird maritime laws, talk about subject matter jurisdiction, being a sovereign citizen, which is so interesting to me. We'll talk about this. And sorry, I feel like I'll get sovereign citizen trolls like I did with the Lacey Peterson case. Let me talk about that real quick. So I covered in my last True Crime Convos the Lacey Peterson episode that Rabia and Ellen did for their new show, Rabia and Ellen Solve the Case. And I cannot tell you how often I had to say, I'm just reviewing the show. I'm not reviewing the case, their thoughts on the case, their conjectures about Scott's innocence or guilt. I thought they made some compelling arguments, but do I think that's enough to say Scott Peterson is innocent? No. But I cannot tell you how many people need to step outside, breathe some fresh air, and touch some grass. Because it's just like they think coming to me and telling me how much they dislike them is going to do something. It will not. You are yelling into an ether. And while I appreciate you sharing your concerns with me, I can't do anything with those. And it's not going to change the information that I shared in that podcast. I think if you're a reasonable person, you understand. Listen, Scott's already behind bars, okay? If you're on the side that Scott is guilty, my friends, you have nothing to worry about. He is behind bars. If he ends up being granted a new trial, that's his right. Within our criminal justice system, that's his right. And he has the right to an attorney who is going to defend him, just as much as the state has the right to prosecute him again for Lacey and Connor's deaths. So, I think it's kind of a moot point to, like I said, yell out into the ether, I hate Rabia and I hate Ellen and Scott's guilty as sin. I hear you. Amazing that you feel that way. Congratulations. Those words are not meant for me, and so I do not accept them. But you're absolutely 100% welcome to continue chiming off in those YouTube comments if you'd like to. Again, not a situation that I care to engage in. And honestly, sometimes I do engage with the trolls because I think it's funny, and that's my toxic trait. So apologies on that. But if you are looking for an interesting thing to read, head to that episode in the YouTube comments and you'll see there was a guy who was saying I was deleting comments. And I was like, my guy, I'm not deleting comments because I think it's hilarious that you are spending so much time on this show. And so much time like actually actively hating these people. It, you know, if I needed a job, that's the job that I would take, because it seems to take up a lot of their time, and maybe they don't have better things to do or other things to look forward to. I do, therefore I do not spend a lot of time with it. But sometimes when I'm bored or I need a little laugh, I'll engage with the trolls. It's not the best thing to do. I'm sorry. But yeah, when you come onto my channel, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. That's just what's going to happen. So it doesn't change anything for me. You're yelling into the ether. Continue about your day. Good day, sir. I said good day, etc. Okay. So I mentioned earlier in the pre-trial hearing that happened, it's on YouTube again, the Law and Crime Network is incredible to watch if you are a person who enjoys watching trials as they happen. So repeatedly, in multiple settings and sessions of court, he claims to not understand very simple concepts or questions presented to him. And apparently, he doesn't recognize his own name, saying that's not who I am, while also refusing to provide an alternative name to those on all his documents and identification. And this is a whole sovereign citizen thing, right? This is why I even started talking about trolls, because I guess sovereign citizens are also troll-likes, which is not surprising. But it's interesting to me that because words are capitalized, that's your like corporate name or something, your straw man name. I don't even understand it because it's so stupid. And he's like, that's not my name because these are capital letters. That's the straw man fallacy, something ridiculous. And it's interesting to me that you're a sovereign citizen of the United States, meaning that you don't recognize, and maybe I have this wrong, so maybe that's why it sounds ridiculous as I'm saying it, but you're a sovereign citizen of the United States, therefore you don't recognize the laws of the United States, which would, in my mind, include the Constitution. But he constantly cited his constitutional rights. And I'm like, but you're a sovereign citizen. You don't recognize the Constitution. You don't recognize the laws of the land. So the fact that you're even going through the system should tell you that the laws of the land are just, or maybe not just, but they're there, and are applied. I can't even say they're applied equally because we have wrongful convictions, as we've seen in the Adnan Syed case. So you know what I mean? You know what I'm trying to say, basically. Like, it's dumb to say I have these rights when you don't believe the rights exist to hold you accountable. So anyway, and the name thing, like, for the record, I'd like to say I don't recognize that name's like record noted if I was a judge. And he also blamed the judge and the court for not allowing him enough time to prepare, as though he wasn't the person solely responsible for firing his attorneys literally just before the trial began. So like, dude, that's on you. And I've seen it to where they've had, if they're defending themselves, they have legal counsel on site to help them. He didn't have that. So he was solo dolo on everything. Now, October 6th, there wasn't much of an improvement in terms of his conduct and the delays that he was trying to continue. He continued to claim that he didn't recognize his name, and he interrupted Dora I don't know how many times. Later on towards the trial, as it's closing, she did keep a tally so that she can mark it for the record. But my gosh, before that, it was consistent, constant, always. So she ends up ordering, because it's happening so often, she ends up ordering him to another courtroom, which is adjacent to the one they're in. And it has, AV speakers. So even if he's muted, he can still hear. So this forced him to communicate via video call, which meant that she could mute his microphone, which was a blessing some days if he was being disruptive, which was all the time. So still in the other room, once the jurors arrived, he strips off his jail uniform. This is October 6th, so you can actually watch this. He ends up taking off his uniform and he sits on the table and he turns his back to the camera like a petulant child. And he also shoved a sign that was meant for signaling that he had an objection into the front of his pants, because totally rational human being, totally professional, gets it. Now, Judge Doro did not understand why she did this so often. It's like that mom that is practicing gentle parenting, but it's like super gentle parenting, to where she's like, okay, I said if you don't, I'm going to give you one more chance. Are you sure? I'm going to give you one more chance. I'm going to give you one more chance. You're like, okay, the chances have passed. Leave his ass in there. She did that constantly, where she would give him another opportunity to come into the courtroom, and he would be like, no, I'm not going to do it. And then they come back from the break and he's in there. So once he was allowed back in the courtroom after break on the 6th, he continued to say that he didn't understand what was happening. And Doro didn't believe him and told him to stop interrupting. And she asked kind of some poignant questions like, what's the last grade of school you completed? And he was like, oh, I got my GED at this grade right after I quit school. And I'm like, okay, dummy, that implies you have some reading comprehension. So she was like, do you know how to read and write? And she goes, yeah, of course, obviously. The reason she's not asking these questions is because he's actually being an idiot. Man, I don't know a case in terms of a perpetrator's conduct that has pissed me off more than Daryl Brooks. So October 11th, they're running behind schedule because of the constant interruptions, and the prosecution brings this up to the judge. And despite the state's own efficiency in questioning, Brooks dragged out each and every cross-examination. Before he would answer and before he would say anything, or the prosecutor would say objection, he would go grounds. And they are trying to say the grounds right after that, but he would go grounds. And you're just like, bro, give him a second. He'll give you the grounds. Doro will either sustain or, what's the other? I forgot it. Sustain or overruled, basically. So this was, again, another delay tactic that he was employing. And throughout the course of the trial, Brooks had continuously questioned the court's jurisdiction, and did so again on this day. And he said, I mean, we haven't even established that the plaintiff is a living human being and not an entity. He kept trying to call the state of Wisconsin to the stand, and the judge kept denying the request because he needed to name a person. And he was like, no, I'm calling the state because that's the plaintiff. It's the plaintiff here. And you're just like, oh my God, dude. So on October 12th, and again, some of this is happening in front of the jury. So despite Doro's attempt to preserve his image to the jury, Brooks does himself a disfavor in this. And if I was on the jury, I would be pissed, because the number of times they've had to come in, come out, come in, come out. They're coming right in. Oh, nope, they're going back out because of his antics. I would be so annoyed that this dude is wasting my time. When I'm trying to be fair towards him in my observation of the evidence and the information that's being presented towards me. So on October 12th, he attempts to subpoena the state of Wisconsin. And this is where the judge points out that he can't subpoena the state of Wisconsin because the state is an entity and only people can testify. And he goes, well, under the 6th Amendment, I have a right to face my accuser. So the subpoena was discarded because his argument was stupid and baseless. And Doro ends up calling a recess after there's a tornado warning that was issued for the county. So court was essentially ended for that day, which put them behind again. So the next day is the 13th, witness testimony followed by a 50-minute rant from Brooks. And it made about as much sense as you would expect, which was none. And he yet again berated the court for his lack of understanding, being treated unfairly, being told to be quiet, not bringing forth the plaintiff, challenging the jurisdiction of the court, and claimed that his constitutional rights were continuously being violated. All of which he had been repeating for literally the entire trial. I think it was an ongoing joke on Law and Crime's Twitter. They're like, I wonder what his first question's going to be, or I wonder what his first motion's going to be. And it's going to be subject matter jurisdiction. So, yeah, all of which, again, like I said, had been repeated throughout the entire trial thus far. And it called for Judge Doro to constantly quiet and remove him from the proceedings in order to continue. And Doro gave DA Susan Opper the chance to respond. She called it, in regards to his 50-minute rant, she called it legal mumbo jumbo, saying he has an agenda to stall, delay, disrupt, intimidate, and it's not going to work. And it did not work. On October 14th, Brooks was already opening the day with his favorite argument, which was subject matter jurisdiction, barely 2 minutes in. And Dora responded, like, this is an irrelevant matter. You're attempting to bring this up in front of a jury, so please show some respect for decorum, which she constantly said. And then she excused the jury and tolerated some more arguing from Brooks before calling a recess so he could calm down, because he was excitable that day. I mean, angry. He kept repeating himself, and he questioned witnesses for hours, irrelevant questions, and he quizzed them on the way that they used his name, and he would still refuse to respond to that name. He would take offense when the officer Schulten referred to the suspect in the case as you, meaning he goes, well, when you say you, who are you talking about? And he goes, you, Daryl Brooks, the guy standing at the defense table. Unsurprisingly, he was not happy with that response or that answer. He also asked repeatedly whether or not the witness knew who the plaintiff in the case was, which again was not an appropriate question to ask. There wasn't a lot that happened on the 17th. Ryder testified about his experience, which was Tyler. He testified about his experience with Brooks as a homeless man. Oh, sorry. No, Ryder was the gentleman who allowed him in his home. So he testified about his experience with Brooks as a homeless man, asking to use his phone and mentioning that he made a total of $23,000 selling the Ring doorbell video of the scene. Which, I mean, you have the information, you're selling it. It's not like I mean, it was taken in as evidence as well. So I don't know. How do you guys feel about that? How do you feel about somebody selling the Ring video? So Brooks asked if he would say this was quite a nice profit, and nobody is sure where he was going with that line of questioning, if he was trying to say, question his credibility. But again, none of this would have happened had Daryl Brooks not come to his home. So is it on the resident to own? I don't know. I don't feel necessarily gross about that. I would say that if I had Ring evidence that wasn't gruesome, I wouldn't have a problem getting rid of it and saying, like, sure, pay me some money. $23K? That's a nice drop in the bucket. I don't know who was paying for that, but again, there you have it. So October 18th was the first day that Brooks was allowed to call a witness. Prosecution had actually not yet rested, but the schedule of a Spanish translator had to be accommodated for the testimony because Brooks refused to list who he was going to call in order. He refused to give them times, not understanding that these people aren't just hanging out in the courtroom every day. So he tried to impeach one of the witnesses, who was Juan Marquez, for apparently saying in a police report that he thought the vehicle that hit him might have been black. So Marquez was actually marching in the parade, and he was struck from behind, getting thrown about 15 to 20 feet in the air. So he never actually saw the vehicle that hit him. And another officer, whose name was Officer Carpenter, he testified, and he detailed the 5-hour-long interview that he held with Brooks the day following the attack. Actually, FBI agent, just kidding. And pointed out the inconsistencies and the bizarre details in Brooks' story, such as Brooks said in the interview that he supposedly came to Waukesha that day with a friend, but he wouldn't give the name of that friend to watch a Packers game at a friend of his friend's house. And that friend's name was Stephanie, but Brooks didn't know what her last name was, what neighborhood she lived in, couldn't remember a thing. So throughout the day, again, Doro ends up ordering Brooks to be removed to another courtroom to prevent his constant interruptions. And this was the first time that she had actually done that while the jury was present. She spent a lot of time, like I said, ensuring that his image in front of the jury was not tarnished. But unfortunately for Daryl Brooks, he can't help himself. So he was the person responsible for marring his image in front of the jury. And, despite his protestations that he was not getting a fair trial, I've never seen a more fair trial take place. But on October 19th, the jury is shown evidence connecting Brooks to the attack and its aftermath. This included the sweatshirt he had been wearing, CCTV footage showing his movements that day, and the testimony of a mechanical inspector who said nothing was wrong with the car that would have prevented Brooks from braking or steering properly. Police Chief Johnson had written a report about paperwork he had found in Brooks' SUV after he had been taken into custody, and Brooks claimed this evidence had not been disclosed or presented to him. And Doro, after again dismissing the jury, advised Brooks to be quiet so the jury could return. So naturally, he took this as talk as loud as possible, as often as possible, and he became defensive and argued that no one could tell him what to do. And he goes, "You're making a record of incorrect statements." And he kept saying, "Are you asking me or telling me? Because nobody tells me what to do," which I think is hilarious given the fact that he was currently in jail custody. So a lot of people throughout the day are telling him what to do and not asking him. October 20th brought a moment of relative levity as DA Opper introduced a rap video as evidence. And it shows Brooks standing in front of the same red Ford SUV that he says, "That was not the car I was in," used as a weapon in the parade in an attempt to link him to the vehicle. Now, that video has since been removed from YouTube, but there are other social media accounts that Brooks' rapper name is shown, and it's literally the lamest rap name I've ever seen in my life, and I don't want to say it, so I'm not going to. If you're interested, you can look it up, but it's terrible rap and a stupid name. Now, when this video was presented, it agitated him so much. You could see it in his face. Opper then said she was getting tired of Brooks questioning the ethics of the court. She laid into him in this kind of soliloquy that she did. She said he continues to impugn the integrity of this court without a basis. He doesn't like it because the evidence is stacking up and stacking up against him. I do not appreciate his impugning the integrity of these proceedings, Your Honor's efforts to run a fair trial, and our efforts to run a fair trial. And Doro agreed with her. She said she was tired of Brooks rolling his eyes and gesturing at her, as well as baselessly fighting with her. And Brooks said, "I don't like your tone." And Doro told him to sit down and stop talking. The next day in court, because of everything that had happened the day before, oh man, this was kind of like the breaking point in court. October 21st, this is 3 weeks into the 4-week-long trial. This is where that breaking point is reached. Brooks calls his ex-girlfriend as a defense witness, and he claimed she had sent him photos while he was in jail, which was supposed to attack her credibility, as it would have contradicted her testimony that she had not spoken to him since the 21st of November. So he ends up, while he's saying, like, "Did you send me these pictures?" and pulls up pictures that were not admitted into evidence to show the witness, which is a huge no-no. You don't just pop evidence up and say, "Have you seen this?" without it going to the prosecution first and then going to the judge for review to see if it's relevant in the trial. He just popped up those pictures and showed it, and they were of his children, which was bizarre. So Doro questioned the authenticity of this, asking whether she had signed the letter or anything else that would establish its origins, because he said, "I have the letter. She sent this to me. I know she sent this to me." And Doro's like, "Okay, well, did she sign it? Is there any way to identify maybe an address on there?" And he goes, "Who signs letters? Who does that?" I'm like, lots of people sign letters. I've signed letters to people I've written in jail, even on emails. I'm like, "Bye, Lainey," or something. Everybody, I feel, signs letters. There are more people that sign letters than don't. So his argument made no sense. So Doro said if he wanted to, because his big thing is like, why do I have to go through all of this hassle to submit evidence when the prosecution can just make up evidence as they want to, have it admitted for the record, and I have to go through all of these steps? And so she goes, "Listen, if you want, you can go retrieve the letter during a break and bring it back to me before, and we can look at seeing if this can be admissible." And lo and behold, he never produces that letter. So strange. He also asked the woman, his ex-girlfriend, an improper question about how they had met and the child that they shared. He was disruptive and defiant in his behavior and questioning, which prompted Doro to yet again remove him from the courtroom. And when he was eventually allowed to return again, he continued to interrupt and was again removed. He refused to call his next witness from the side room. He raised his voice in objection to his removal and slammed his headphones down, which were used to hear what the judge was saying. And there were also speakers, so he didn't necessarily always need to use the headphones. He just said he had trouble hearing through one of his ears, so the headphones were offered kind of as an additional thing. Doro asked him to just present yourself with integrity, decorum, and respect, and you'll be allowed back in. So after recess, he was allowed back into the courtroom, and he then claimed it was apparent that the witnesses had been coached by the prosecution on how to answer his questions, which, I mean, if that's true, kudos to the prosecution for being able to understand his mind and understand his line of questioning, because none of it made sense. None of it was relevant to the actual evidence in the case or the case itself. So kudos to them. Now, after that, Doro said, okay, your claims are baseless. And it was at that point that Brooks ends up slamming his fist on the table. He becomes silent and he fixates on Doro with a deep frown and unblinking stare. I mean, he is literally staring at her like, man, I really wish I could just take these ankle, what are they called? Ankle shackles off and just like dive at you, strangle you to death, and watch the life drain from your eyes. That's truly how he was looking at her. I was watching this trial live, and it was just, I mean, like that. I don't know how else to describe it. And so because of that, the judge ended up calling a recess or getting another break started, because she said, quite frankly, he's staring at me. He's banged his fist on the desk, and it makes me scared. And so she called for a break. So the next witnesses, remember, these are defense witnesses, right? These are people Daryl called to aid in his defense. His ex-girlfriend, the person he attacked. And then all of that led to him mowing down 60 plus people. In my rational brain, as a rational person, which is what the court asks us to be, I wouldn't call those people in my defense. But he did. He called victims of the incident. So the first person was Kathleen Urell, who recounted the injuries all 4 of her children sustained. That was probably one of the most brutal things to watch this mother have to recount the injuries in front and to the man who caused them. I mean, her children were severely harmed and severely disabled because of his actions that day. And he's basically trying to discredit her children's injuries and say, like, I mean, you could have moved them. You know what I mean? Like, are you sure it was me? Are you sure you saw me? Are you sure it was my car? Are you sure? And when you're witnessing your children literally being mowed down, I don't think there's a lot you forget about that day. The next person was Catrice Babies, who spoke of the mental trauma that she had suffered. She was a really strong witness, definitely not for the defense, but for the prosecution. So during the cross-examination, Brooks refused to sit down despite the judge instructing him to sit down to show the witness some respect. At every time he was questioning a witness, he was standing up. My belief is an attempt to intimidate them, to say, like, I'm not showing you any form of respect because you're a liar and I'm questioning your credibility. And maybe that's what he's watched on like shows like Matlock. I have no idea. So he repeatedly objected to the prosecutor's questions, then complained when Doro overruled every single one of his. During his redirect examination of Catrice, he rolled his eyes at her and again asked inane questions about how she knew his name. So at this point, Doro was over it. She halted his questioning, and Brooks said, "How are you even a judge?" And so she ends up ending his testimony because she's like, you need to move on and ask the next question. Subject to rule like 96 something. She cited that rule a lot, which was, I think, State versus Allen. So he continued to raise his voice because he was pissed off that she ended his questioning, because, again, he forfeited his right to continue questioning this witness because he refused to move on and ask relevant questions related to the evidence or related to prior testimony that she gave for the prosecution. So he continues to raise his voice to her and claims that the courtroom had no integrity whatsoever before, again, surprise, surprise, being removed himself. So he has no choice on the 24th. Typically, the defense and the prosecution make a determination of when they're going to end their case. On October 24th, Darrell Brooks had to rest his case. He claimed that he might call a witness tomorrow, but this was later denied by the judge because it was causing interruptions, and the misbehavior that he was continuing to display in court was just causing more and more disruption, more and more delay. And so he also claimed that he couldn't hear the judge despite his audio and video connections being perfectly fine. And so she continued to give him chance after chance to give the information. If he was going to call another witness, to call it. And he basically refused. He continued to walk around answering the question, continuing to say he didn't understand, continuing to argue and interrupt the judge. And so she said, okay, you forfeited your right, as and held to, I think, a hearing. Again, I think it was State versus Allen that she held to. So basically, like with State versus Allen, it essentially says that the defendant forfeits the right to be in the courtroom, the defendant forfeits the right to question or to take part in their own defense when they're being disruptive to the proceedings and delaying the proceedings. So the judge gives them a certain amount of attempts before she says they forfeited, and continues to ask them, hey, are you sure? Hey, do you want to do this? And credit to Judge Doro, because she did an incredible job, again, of trying to make sure there was no wiggle room for a mistrial, no wiggle room for a appeal. I couldn't imagine what he would. I mean, I'm sure he is going to appeal his sentence, but I can't imagine that any reasonable court would look at this and go, for sure, definitely going to get it. So the next day, closing arguments. He's basically told on the 24th, you forfeited your right. The defense is rested. You need to be ready to make your closing arguments, which of course he tries to delay. And Judge Doro has none of it. So reluctantly, he gives his closing arguments, and he claims that, listen, my car may have malfunctioned on the day of the parade, and that's not true. It was not introduced into evidence. In fact, it was disputed in evidence. So he was saying statements that were not in evidence, and so he can't use that as part of his closing argument. He still claimed that he was not the person driving it, despite there being video evidence and despite there being photographic evidence. He said that, the person who was actually driving the car, and again, even if he was a passenger in this car, like he's apparently saying he was or wasn't, if he was a passenger in this car, I would think, seeing the person you came to town with mowing down people, you would do pretty much anything. At least I would hope. I know I would, to put the car in park, to grab the wheel, to do something, to yell at the window saying, get everybody out of the way, anything. So even then, as a good Samaritan, he didn't act in a way that would say, I'm trying to prevent tragedy from happening. So he, both of those claims that he made were stricken from the record by Doro because they had been proven false by the evidence. And so he asked the jury to think about the effect this was having on his family and his children, and the fact that he has his children writing him and saying, Dad, why are they saying these bad things about you? And the prosecution, in their rebuttal to his closing, basically say, you should answer your children. You should answer those questions. And reiterated that Darrell Brooks had made this trial all about him, that he accepted no accountability for what he did. In fact, he tried to skirt accountability. He made a mockery of the proceedings. He made a mockery of the state and of the victims. And I think you really could see his true colors, because in his opening statements, he's crying, blubbering, just being like, I hope you can see. And you can tell it was all a show for him. Same thing with the closing arguments. He had displayed such egregious behavior in front of the jury and outside of the jury's presence that seeing him turn this on and saying, like, all of these things. Like, you have the power. I want you to know you have the power to, which was a huge thing. The judge didn't want him to say, but Attorney Opper basically said, like, let him give his closing statement. We'll object to whatever we hear that's, objectable, which was pretty much his entire defense. So he basically said that the jury had the right to kind of nullify the verdict and the charges against him. So, yeah. The judge did not want him to say that because it wasn't true. While they do have the power to nullify, they didn't have the right to, which is a very distinct difference. So on October 26th, the jury gets the case on the 25th. They spend, I think, an hour deliberating, and then they call it a night and go back to the hotel to come back the next day to deliberate. They come back, I think it's maybe by like 10 o'clock. So 2 hours-ish, maybe 3 hours total. They come back with a verdict. No surprise to me. I don't think, I always get a little worried when somebody is like giving their own closing arguments and defending themselves, because I'm like, man, what if they really do convince somebody on that jury that they didn't do it, or that they weren't as culpable as the state says they are? And I always worried about that. In particular with this, I'm like, what if there's that one person that believes in this sovereign citizen argument who's on the jury and creates a hung jury, right? Like, what if that happens? I would have been astounded if there was a hung jury in this case, and I was a little worried about it, honestly. I mean, you can never ever hedge your bets when it comes to a jury trial of what the jury is going to come back with. So they ended up coming back after 3 hours and found him guilty on each of the charges. There were 6 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, 61 counts of recklessly endangering safety, 6 counts of hit and run causing death, and 2 counts of bail jumping, and 1 count of misdemeanor battery. There was also the first-degree intentional homicide charges that carried a mandatory life sentence, so he is for sure getting that. And then early in the morning, oh my gosh, and this is the other thing. This is what kind of pisses me off about people who don't realize these pranks and these jokes that they're posting on Twitter, on Reddit, on Facebook, wherever, really have the potential to negatively impact the victims of this trial. So earlier that morning, Brooks had tried to get a mistrial because there was a Reddit account pretending to be a juror in the proceedings. This Reddit post came up anonymously, obviously, and essentially said that I'm a juror on the Darrell Brooks trial, and yeah, I believe everything he's saying, and the judge is being unfair to him, and he makes a lot of good points and all this, if you could have seen the evidence, etc. And of course, that's sent to the court. It was actually the court was made aware on the 26th. So an investigation is still pending on that. But the court was made aware on the 26th. She didn't tell the defense or the prosecution about it until that morning, the next day, because the Redditor who made the post had come back and said, oh my gosh, had no idea this would be taken seriously. It was just a prank, you guys. And it was removed from Reddit. The post was deleted. But could you imagine if there was no way, because the jury was sequestered, right? They had to turn in their phones. They had to turn in all electronic devices. So at the time the post was made, there was no way for any member of the jury to make that post on Reddit. So it was easily determined that they didn't actually make the post. But could you imagine if they hadn't been sequestered, or if there was some instance of not being able to verify that their mobile devices were turned in? I was just like, oh my gosh, this person is such an idiot. And I truly hope that Reddit turns over their information if there's a subpoena to it, as there's an investigation pending. I truly, truly hope that that person who made that post has some charges brought against them. Because if I was a family member, a family advocate, or even a survivor of this attack, I would be absolutely gutted if this had resulted in a mistrial because of that. And then you'd have to start all over again. And you gave Darrell Brooks exactly what he wanted. I would have been so pissed. Honestly, I would go after that person civilly too for the emotional distress that they would have caused just within that last 24 hours. I don't know if anyone else is on board with that, but I just kept thinking of the family in those instances and the parents who had lost their children, or the adults who had lost their elderly mother and father, or their elderly grandmother, etc., who was dancing in a parade. Freaking ridiculous. I would have been so angry. So that gets denied. And then a press conference happens, and DA Opper says that Brooks tried every tactic in the book except saying the dog ate my homework excuse, which was nice. And he told nothing but lies and stories throughout the trial. And so on Monday, there was a hearing held to determine when sentencing would take place, and also for the judge to understand how many people would potentially want to speak for either side for impact statements. So the prosecution gave a list of dates that would work for them, probably sometime in mid-November, like right before the Thanksgiving holiday, because they also had additional cases coming up. And they said they had about maybe 40 or so people that wanted to speak, which is understandable. Remember, this is a 60 plus count indictment that happened, and 76 charges in total is what he was found guilty of. So 60 plus people and more, really, depending on how you look at it, were impacted. So 40 makes sense. And then, of course, when it gets to Darrell, he has pending charges in Milwaukee for, I think, bail jumping. He has pending charges in Nevada for failing to register as a sex offender related to his ex-girlfriend, who he impregnated as a teenager, and who he was also engaged in sex trafficking with, or sex trafficking her. She was a victim of sex trafficking. So he says, listen, I need some time. Like, I'm not trying to be disruptive. I'm not trying to delay anything, but I need some time to get my affairs in order. I need some time to, get things together and let people know. And the judge sees right through this and goes, listen, I will have Zoom available and I will have in-person available. You need to get me names by X date, and I need to know who they are who's going to be testifying for you, or, giving a statement on your behalf. And he says at least 20 people for sure. And I was like, I would love to see it. You let me know, because I can't wait. So the sentencing is supposed to happen on the 15th and 16th. The 15th is for the victim impact statements and whoever decides to show up on Darrell's behalf. Maybe his mom. I don't know. I don't know of anyone else who would speak on his behalf that has supported him through this. And I would think that anybody who does is going to be fodder for the news media in the future. So I would really be surprised if anybody stepped up to do that for him. So yeah, November 15th and 16th. So the 16th will be the actual sentencing. We'll find out the totality of his sentencing, and we'll go from there. But that is it for this evening's True Crime Convos. I really appreciate you all joining me, even in the later viewings. Once this episode is wrapped, I appreciate you joining in the replay. And as always, you can find me at True Crime Cases podcast.com or True Crime Cases on Instagram, and True Crime_cases on Twitter, or you can click the link here in my bio and it'll send you to all of my social media. You can listen to my narrative true crime podcast called True Crime Cases with Lainey, and you'll also find True Crime Convos on your podcast player of choice under True Crime Convos. But I really appreciate you starting your Tuesday with me, or ending your Tuesday with me, and I will look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks for another episode. Make sure you follow, subscribe, whatever you like to do. And again, I appreciate you all for joining me, and I hope you all have a great rest of the evening. Make sure you wash your hands. And if you've joined us in studio or in the replay and you want to be entered in to win some merch from True Crime Cases with Lainey, I think I have an episode or sticker here. We have some sticker merch, we have keychains, etc. So if you're interested in that, feel free to send me an email and I will put the email in our link here. But if you follow me on any one of the social media, you can also DM me showing me a screenshot that you joined online or in the replay. tcfcpod@gmail.com, showing me that you have joined in, listened in. That could be on the podcast page or in any of the replay formats, and I will happily send you